Hi, this is Phoenix, and I wanted to share a few thoughts on my book, Silent Noise, which is currently free for Kindle until November 21st of 2017, which you can find on my author page at amazon.com/author/phoenix_rises. I just have a few thoughts on Silent Noise, as you hopefully are downloading your free copy. Basically, I wanted to describe how the book is really important in my uh, bibliography because it offers a very sensitive counter perspective to some of my more heavy philosophical points. It's interesting to think about Silent Noise because it's basically a tour of poetry, and I start with Plato and his theory of mimesis, as well as ancient poets like Li Po, and I move all the way towards contemporary poetry, specifically contemporary experimental poetry. And the book itself is interesting as a tour of history, as a kind of tour de force of the history of poetry, because it's very inclusive. So when I went to college, I felt a kind of exclusivity when it came to thinking about texts, one that I found to be, even though it was supposed to be very specific and specialized, it just didn't seem very all encompassing. And I've always been a kind of like encompassing kind of writer because I read very broadly and I read things that are either obscure or popular. It really doesn't matter. I don't care. Um, I want to keep my reading list broad. It's interesting because one of the movements uh, that is often appreciated in college, at least in certain classes, is this idea of um, modernism. And it's interesting how I reference the modernists as an interesting staple. Uh, at least you experience this when you're reading about Micah's experience, that modernism is a staple for him, at least for his poetic practices, and that begins his process of understanding later more contemporary poems. But it's interesting because basically, basically he really likes Dante. Dante's his favorite poet, and this was always an interesting confession for me when thinking about my book Silent Noise, because I'm basically thinking about how I really like Dante's kind of grand style of poetry, which I feel isn't necessarily appreciated in the same way that other more radical texts are appreciated. And I've been thinking a lot about like kind of my taste in poetry and my taste in writing. And I have to admit, I do have a soft spot for literature. I know that this was kind of beaten out of us in college. At least that was my experience. And I haven't figured out why I like classic literature so much. Perhaps it is just my response to thinking about what people said. Of course, as I said, I read very broadly, and so I read a lot of texts that may not necessarily specifically fit in medieval literature or isn't necessarily medieval literature. But I just find that kind of trend to be fascinating and maybe even a little bit countercultural. This doesn't mean that I worship the classics, of course. It just means that I find their ideas and their use of language to be interesting. Silent Noise is a fascinating book from my perspective and an important book from my perspective because it deals with a lot of themes of um, coming to your own, of coming to your age, and really trying to understand what life is about and what your values are and what you care about. And I feel like I exemplify a lot of this in the main protagonist kid, Micah Smith. Anyway, I could talk about the book forever, but I'll spare you. But I hope that you'll check the book out. And again, you can find the book on my Amazon page at amazon.com/author/phoenix_rises. This is Phoenix, and thank you.